one way of looking at science is that it's a collection of facts, right? That's what Piaget is stating to begin with, and that we assume that the facts that science has gathered are facts and static. But if you observe them across time, what you find is that scientific facts tend to shift and transform, because scientific theories that are applicable in one century, let's say, turn out to be less applicable in the next. Now, there's been a lot of argument and discussion about this, because the fact that facts change seems to indicate that they're not so self-evidently facts. And there are people, and perhaps Kuhn would be among them, who believe that science consisted of the juxtaposition of paradigms, so those are sets of axioms within which something operates, and the paradigms, he considered them often incommensurate. You couldn't move from one to another because the axioms were different. There was no necessary, what might you say? There was no necessary means of communication between them. But and Piaget knew of Thomas Kuhn's work. That's the Structure of Scientific Revolutions, which was published in 1962. It's a classic text in the philosophy of science. And what Piaget assumed more was more like I would say more like a classic view of science, where, so for example, when Newton came up with Newtonian physics, there was a set of propositions upon which Newtonian physics was based. And then when Einstein transformed those propositions, what happened was that Newtonian physics became a subset of Einsteinian physics. And so the way that Piaget looked at the development of factual ideas, at least in part, was that you'd come up with a set of ideas that were facts, and then that would be superseded by a different theory within which that original theory would be nested. And so that what happens that each theory, in some sense, although it transforms, it becomes more complete as scientific progression continues. Now, Kuhn didn't precisely believe that, although exactly what Kuhn meant by a paradigm shift, because Kuhn originated that term, isn't clear, but he didn't seem to actually believe that science had this capacity to present a series of facts and then alter the underlying presuppositions and then to nest that within a broader series of facts, like you would assume if you were thinking about the relationship between Newton and Einstein. So Newtonian physics is a subset of Einsteinian physics. So now that's kind of how Piaget thought about how human beings develop knowledge. He believed that we came up with, well, let's say you wanted to chop down a tree. That might be a good example. I mean, you could use a dull axe made of bronze. And it's like, well, that would chop down the tree. It'd be a lot of work, though. And then maybe you replace that with a sharp steel axe that's designed like a wedge so that you can really hack down a tree with it. Or maybe you replace it with a saw. And so it's not like the bronze axe couldn't chop down the tree, but the steel axe can do a better job, and the saw can do even a better job. And so the way that Piaget thought about the transformation of human knowledge structures from infancy onward, essentially, was that infants would produce a representation of the world that was sort of low resolution, but quite tool-like. It would work in the world, but then as they progressed, the nature of those tools would become refined and sometimes transform completely. So sometimes you imagine that a child would use, in a sense, a low-resolution picture of something, and then they would increase its resolution as they filled in the details. That would be assimilation. That's the Piagetian notion of assimilation. You're using the same basic theory but filling in the details, and then now and then you'd have to switch to another picture entirely, and that would be more like accommodation. That's where you'd have to transform your internal structures completely in order to properly represent and act within the world. And so that's the basic difference between accommodation and assimilation. So assimilation is like micro alterations, and accommodation is transformation of the knowledge structure itself. And so that's part of, so what Kuhn pointed out was that there'd be a set of facts and then there'd be an anomaly arise of some sort. So like at the end of the 19th century, the only remaining anomaly was, at least one of the remaining anomalies was that no matter which direction you shine a light beam in, and no matter how fast the platform on which you're standing is moving, the light beam has exactly the same velocity, which seems impossible. So, you know, if the Earth is moving this way around the sun and you shine a light off the Earth, you'd expect the speed of light to be the speed of light plus the speed of the Earth. And then if you shone it the other way, then you'd expect the speed of light to be the speed of light minus the Earth's speed. But that isn't what happens. No matter how fast the platform on which the person shining the light is standing, the speed of light is always the same to every observer. So, and people kind of thought of that as, that wasn't the only anomaly, but that was one of them, thought of that as the only anomaly left in physics at the end of the 19th century, and turned out that was a bad one. There were some other ones as well, like the fact that light tends to behave as a wave and a particle more or less at the same time, which doesn't seem possible. So there's a couple of things left over in Newtonian physics that the Newtonian physics couldn't explain, but by the end of the 19th century, there were famous scientists saying, yeah, well, we got this all wrapped up. There's really nothing left to discover. And then along came quantum mechanics and Einsteinian relativity, and bang, the whole world was like really different. And quantum mechanics is much more comprehensive theory of the world than Newtonian physics. All of the electronics you use wouldn't work if quantum physics wasn't correct, roughly speaking. And so that little tiny anomaly blew into something that knocked the slats out from underneath the entire axiomatic structure of Newtonian physics. It showed it was wrong at its fundamental levels, even though it turned out to be a correct subset of something that was much broader. And so you can kind of think of that as that's what kids are doing as they progress. They develop a theory that accounts for a certain set of, you could say, facts, but this is another place it gets tricky. And then they modify those and make them more and more refined, but now and then they have to undergo quite a transformation. And that'd be a stage transition in Piagetian thought. That's the stage transition idea. And that would be akin in some sense to a Kuhnian scientific revolution. Now, what Piaget is trying to state here is that because there's this weird problem with facts, which is that they tend to transform across time. You know, like if you go take a biology course right now, in 20 years, pretty much everything you learned, or very much of what you learned, will turn out to have been wrong. And that's kind of weird because it isn't wrong right now. And you'd think, well, how can it be wrong in 20 years? And that's a really complicated problem. And in order to solve that, you kind of have to think about facts like tools instead of them as thinking about them as objective independent realities, because a bad tool can still work as a tool, whereas a bad fact just kills you stone dead. Okay, so here's one of Piaget's propositions, and it is that because facts flux in some sense across time, you're looking for something that doesn't change across time to call it a real fact. And so what Piaget is trying to point out in this, let's call it introductory paragraph, is that the one thing that doesn't change is the manner in which people generate facts rather than the facts themselves. So the ultimate fact is a fact about the way people generate facts. All right, and so Piaget's theory in part is a theory about how knowledge is acquired and transformed. And so it's not a study of the knowledge itself, it's a study of the process by which the knowledge is generated. And he believed that process was unchanging, at least with regards to human beings. And so you could think of the Piagetian genetic epistemological mystery as being, how is it that people form and transform representations of the world? And one of his conclusions about that is that there's a standard process.